Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the Tent of Many Voices. This tent is part of a traveling exhibit that has been following the Lewis and Clark Trail since January of 2003. The reason it is called the Tent of Many Voices is because people come from various backgrounds, various walks of life, to tell their side of the Lewis and Clark story. It is a huge story, the story of men that went across this country, a young woman that accompanied them. But it's also a story of the people who were already here, who had inhabited this country for centuries. So with that said, I would like to introduce you to our next presenter. And this is Lois Tyler Nava. And I would like for all of you, Navo, to stand, please, and we'll have a word of prayer before she starts with her presentation.
Kamika and the harp when Naya and my voice when the Kimmy Ogihan when the Taiba one, the may Ogihan when the youngest in time for Nick. O Kawahi when Abbott Samaranina Sudavan Abunik. O Karaiba and Ebon Namanana when I give up struck. Suka marinina sundava sukra mani yang sometimes when the we have when the cake yama we here siki bidets when the cake yaman nana when and when crab bidets yama sa we have no sunga when the I kaban toya with the weekend I ka buy the ham weekend sit the window night weekend never we have siki on siki yahat sa no sugar. So when he went so I can an up and then when they could have Jesus there's never a younger boy, never youngest time. That'll be all. Us. That's all. I wasn't born here, but I was born down Fort Hall, and I've been running back and forth here and down Fort Hall, and I also like it here because my father and my mother, they were from here, and my father, he has his picture in that little log cabin, second from the left, I guess, and my uncles, they both are there, and Chief Tendoy's son was the first one that was standing on the left, and my father and my two uncles, and a short guy, they called him Quina Movie. That means eagle nose. Eagle nose. But later they called him Nino or something. Nino. So I'm proud to be here, and because my people were from here, and I like it here. I was the last one to move to Fort Hall from here. Because I like it here, and my people are kind of proud people, you know. They lived in Lemhi. We had everything. They helped, the white people helped them there and gave them wagons and seeds to plant turnips and carrots and cabbages, and my uncles, They always go, every year in the fall, they go to Montana, over the divide there. They go to Montana, and then they west to Montana, Yellowstone. They get elk from there, and when they get home, they had horses and pack horses to bring the meat over, and the women would prepare to dry it and put them in leather suitcases. They'd lace it up when it's dry, and they pound it, and they lace it up and use it for winter. And everything we get from here, all the berries, they dry it. They dry it, and then they have it, they use it in winter time. And I'm glad that the Montana people took care of our chief here, Tendoy. They erected that monument there for him. I'm always glad to see that, and I always go up there. And we from going back home, and I'm glad that I stayed here long enough when I was running back and forth from Fort Hall to here, and all the merchants here a long time ago, they helped us, and the store people, they bought our gloves and whatever we made. They sure helped us lots. And then the man folks would work for some people here, like cleaning dishes and working on potatoes, and they like it here. And there's a lot of deer around here. That's our food, and salmon. And this town is called Araiba. That means salmon waters. And it forks right down here, the Lemhi and the Salmon River, and that's how they call it Araiba. The salmon goes both ways up Lemhi and up Salmon River and up Stanley. And we had a lot of places to go when we was here, and so I thank everyone that helped us when we was here, staying up here. Our grandchildren went to school, and they played basketball and played football. And when they went down Fort Hall, nowadays they got a job over there. So the teachers over here sure helped them. And I'm glad of that. And then when I see the kids over here, your kids, I know they'll be, take care of you people, us people here when they get old, when they get to be go to school and be they'll take care of us here in Salmon, take care of you people too. So I'm always glad to be here. And I've always, when they have meeting here, I always come. Sacagawea meeting here, I always come with them. And I'd be, kind of glad that she was from here. And she had a brother here, Kim Await. That's how come she wanted to come back. I'm always glad to think of that. And finally, when I was in Fort Hall at my home, there's people that come ask me about Lewis and Clark. So I don't know, I'm 88 years old, but I was born in Fort Hall, and I don't know too much of that. But I heard something about that. My people were in Lemhi, and there's one Indian that went over Lost Trail, and he was hunting, or he went to Montana to Beaverhead around there, and one time he seen strange people. He said, strange people. They had horses and pack horse with them. So he come tell his people that there's a strange man, strange people back in there. So he got home, and they were expecting them. And I guess they came over the trail and went into their reservation there, and I guess to trade horses. They didn't, the chief wasn't, he treated them nice and gave them horses, and I guess he gave them map too. On the ground where they were going, he traced them where they're supposed to go when they got here. He took his finger and told him, you go this way or that way. And that was nice of him, my people. And that's how I remember what they said. And I'm always glad I'm here. And I've also worked around here in potatoes, and I've made gloves, sold them to McPherson's, and that's how they helped us to get our grub. And I can't do those things nowadays. Can't stretch deer hides. can't do a lot of things nowadays, so I'm glad I'm here to see this interpretive center here, what they done for my people and for our people. And so I'm always glad. I guess that's all I gotta say.
Stay just a moment.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have just a few minutes for questions for Lois, if you would like to ask her questions at this time. It's a rare honor and a treat for us to have an elder with us, and we appreciate you coming out very much. So some of you might wish to ask Lois some questions at this time. If you'll raise your hand, I'll come around with a microphone. Yes, ma'am.
Are you grandmother to the Arrow Whites?
No, I'm not.
What were your children's names, or what are they now?
They're my sister's grandchildren.
Grandma Lois had one son. He died real young, and his name was Nathaniel. He was about 1 or 2. So she only had one son, and she was married 2 times. Alfred Nava, he was raised here in Salmon also, and he's buried up here. And they named a road after him, the city of Salmon, because Lois and Alfred were the last 2 to leave here to go to Fort Hall.
I noticed you pronounce it Sacagawea. I wondered if you could speak about the different pronunciations of Sacagawea's name and your take on it.
Yeah, you know any different ways why they said Sacagawea than Sacagawea? Like Rosina, how she says it?
My people know they called her Seguijawohe for Indian, and then nowadays I hear Sacagawea, Seguijawohe. I guess it means she played with a lot of mud and throw them. And then they call her Seguijawohe. Segui means mud, And I don't know. I've heard, I don't know what happened. So I haven't, I guess it was early in years that she was taken before my people didn't say anything about it. But nowadays we heard stories about her and the fine thing she did to come back to her people. I always thought she wanted to come back because she has her brother here, and I don't really know where she is buried, when she died. I've never heard in Wyoming, they say, but I never knew, or my parents didn't know.
A little bit to add to that. We were talking about it. There was, Grandma and other people in our family, and she said that she just got interviewed for Utah State Journal or something like that, and we were talking about it because the lady asked her the same thing about Sacagawea, and we're related to her in a way, but she said it's like being related to someone famous on TV. We didn't think they were going to be a big star, or however you want to say it nowadays. We didn't know of her like that. We just thought of her as a neighbor or someone we knew in the camp. It wasn't someone famous that we knew she was going to go out and be someone. That's how she explained Sacagawea to us. And that's why she's saying we don't, we didn't know at that time. That's the way she looks at it.
I had a question back here.
We met this lady coming over with her granddaughter. She's a Lemhi Shoshone. Can you tell us when you had to go to, and the government basically forced the Shoshone to go to the Fort Hall Reservation down by Pocatello. Can you tell us anything about how that happened?
I guess the government they wanted my people to move over. I want this. That's how I take it. You move over.
Grandma, if you could tell them a little bit about what happened to your home. She told us, and as far as our family knows, she went down to visit in Fort Hall because, like she said, she wasn't born here, but she always was raised here. And the city of Salmon, that this man promised her and her family that they could live there in her home. But she went down to visit in Fort Hall, and somehow they got word that their stuff was in storage and her house was knocked down. So now she resides in Fort Hall.
In the 1980s? 98? 1998. Some other questions? All right, one more, and then we'll go on to the next part.
Do you remember what his son's name was? Tendoy's son.
John Tendoy, I think. And I can't even remember his Indian name either.
He's saying, was it Joe?
Yeah, I think it is Joe Tendoy. He's the first one on that picture standing.
Well, I was going to say, actually, this might be a nice segue into my portion of the presentation, but I think that he had more than one son. There's a book for sale here, though, in the gift shop by Crowder, which has the Tendoy family tree in the back.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's please give Lois Tyler Nava. And we would like to thank you very much for coming. And at this time, if you'll give her one more round of applause, then we're going to turn it over to John Mann.
Got it?
Yeah, seems to be working. You hear me okay? This one? Okay. I'm going to stand up here, play place to put my notes. I think that in the course of my presentation I can address some of the questions that were raised here at some more length. First, though, I'd like to echo the sentiment. What an honor and a pleasure it was to hear from Mrs. Nava. I should explain at the outset how I wound up here. When I was a graduate student at Washington State University, I worked for the Lemhi Recognition Project, a project to restore federal recognition to the Lemhi Shoshone. And this ended up becoming my dissertation, and I'll be a shameless self-promoter here, also a book, which is on sale over here at the Interpretive Center. But in the course of my research, I ran across her name very frequently, so it was really an honor for me to meet her tonight, having read about and then written about her life and her times here in Salmon. I wanted to start off with the Sacagawea coin, and you'll see that I've got the spelling that the Mint chose in quotation marks here. Generally, we could have a whole session here on the controversy over the different spellings of the name and what they mean. But by and large, this one more closely approximates the Shoshone, and the spelling with the G more closely approximates the Mandan Hidatsa. And that's one of several reasons that when this coin came out, Lemhis added their voice to the sort of existing chorus of criticism that surrounded the coin. Many Lemhis argued that this depiction was not accurate, not accurately depicting a Lemhi Shoshone woman. And the timing of that gaffe, only added insult to injury, because this was several years into the recognition process. So while the government tried with the best of intentions to celebrate one of the Lemhi contributions to American history, it sort of insulted them. And I think this speaks to the larger issue of the lack of awareness of the Lemhi Shoshone. Everyone's heard of Sacagawea, and during the Bicentennial, of course, more so, but outside of this region in particular, few people have heard of her people, the Lemhi Shoshone. And I see from the schedule that Greg Campbell will be talking here tomorrow, and he's done pretty extensive work on the Lemhi experience during the 19th century, so I don't want to cover that ground in too much detail, but mainly talk about the Lemhi experience in the 20th century, and especially the way that this country around us was so central to their experience, to their identity, and to their current efforts to regain federal recognition. After the Corps of Discovery, the Lemhi Shoshone had a period in this region where they remained relatively unchanged in terms of encounters with non-Indian peoples, especially relative to some of the other Indian peoples in this region. It wasn't until the 1850s, when a Mormon mission was established here, that there was any sustained contact with non-Indian people in this area. And thereafter, with the discovery of gold over in Montana and the emergence of Salmon as a town, the Lemhis welcomed the non-Indian visitors much as they had Lewis and Clark. At the same time, they remained adamant about staying in this country. And despite an agreement that had been drafted with the government, they refused to leave here for the last few decades of the 19th century. The removal agreement then occurred in 1905, and the best way I can describe it is somewhat suspicious. The Lemhis had been continually and adamantly refusing to remove until this apparent agreement in 1905, when a majority of the adult males on the Lemhi reservation apparently consented to move, and then immediately thereafter started lobbying against this apparent agreement. And so the removal process itself didn't take place until 1907. And one of the pioneers in the Lemhi Valley, Nora Urian Whitwell, described the process in this way. And I'm quoting here from a later recollection. They never left willingly. They packed their meager belongings on horses, strapped the ends on their wickiup poles, stuck the ends of their wickiup poles to the sides of their horses, and they dragged them along. They were very sad and passed through the valley crying. The ranchers along the way could hear their crying for some distance, before they passed their homes. The ranchers were near tears, and some did cry. They were so sorry for them, having to go against their will. I'm still sorry, for we had great respect for Chief Tendoy and his tribe. So as that quotation suggests, I think, the Lemhi were not enthusiastic about leaving their homeland in this region, and they had forged close ties with the non-Indian community here, and many of the members of that community were also not entirely enthusiastic about this removal process. And the Lemhi now, many of them refer to it in retrospect as the Lemhi Trail of Tears. But thereafter, the Lemhis sort of disappear from history and the history books. Most accounts of the Lemhi conclude with removal to Fort Hall in 1907. They enrolled subsequently as members of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes down there, many of them anyway, and the assumption was, well, they're all Shoshone-Bannocks down at Fort Hall now, there are no Lemhis. But as I think Lois's presentation suggested, and as my own research has indicated to me, a very distinct Lemhi identity persisted throughout the course of the 20th century. And as I suggested earlier, that identity was very much tied up with their association with their homeland here in the Salmon River country. And I want to talk about that, I guess, in three ways to elaborate, to be a little more specific about what I'm talking about. First, I want to talk about their efforts to gain restitution for the seizure, first of their reservation, and then in an Indian Claims Commission claim for their homeland here. Secondly, I'd like to talk again, just briefly, about the Lemhi community in Salmon, that despite removal in 1907, persisted throughout most of the 20th century, and even to this day. In fact, there was an article, 3 days ago, I think, in the Salt Lake Tribune about the Lemhi Shoshone and about the activities that we're all gathered here for, and started off by talking about a Lemhi family that had relocated to Salmon. And reading that article, it occurred to me, geez, this is the same thing that's been going on since removal. The Lemhis were moved to Fort Hall, and many of them simply turned around and came back. And those that were at Fort Hall came back to visit on a seasonal, sometimes permanent basis. And then finally, I'd like to talk briefly about the Lemhi's struggle to retain treaty rights to hunt and fish in these areas. I think that these provide three specific examples of what I'm talking about in terms of Lemhi identity being intertwined with their sense of this being their homeland. I'm already falling behind myself here, trying to improvise, but I've got a few slides here. And this shows what the Indian Claims Commission decided was Lemhi territory. Of course, they spent time over in Montana after Buffalo and occupied a territory larger than this, but this is what the Indian Claims Commission determined was the territory that they had exclusive use and occupancy of. Some photographs of the Salmon River country. I'm sorry that some of these images aren't perfect here. Lewis and Clark. Here's Tendoy and one of his sons, not identified. Sorry for the earlier question about which one near here. The tiny reservation, which was liquidated after removal in 1907. But then, well, I'll start, I guess, then with the claims that I wanted to talk about. Almost immediately after ending up at Fort Hall, the Lemhis started pursuing annuity payments that had been promised them for relinquishing their reservation and moving to Fort Hall. And not all of those monies, for a variety of reasons, were paid. So they organized a committee formed only of Lemhis, charged with the task of securing these unpaid annuity monies. And the dollars weren't significant. Even it was a few $1,000s, really. It would have amounted to something like $7 per individual, which in those days was not nothing. But they doggedly pursued these claims. This Lemhi committee remained in existence. It formed almost immediately after they were at Fort Hall. By 1913, they had started to lobby for these monies. And this committee was still active into the 1950s. When the matter wasn't entirely resolved, it ended up being lumped in with some Indian Claims Commission monies and eventually resolved in that way. But the point is that the Salmon River country and Lemhi identity were intertwined insofar as they organized politically to pursue these monies. Then again, after the Indian Claims Commission was formed, and it determined that the Lemhi Shoshones were due $4.5 million for the seizure of their homelands, the Lemhis organized again, this time because the wording of the Indian Claims Commission Act dictated that that claim would be under the jurisdiction of the tribal council at Fort Hall and not the Lemhi Shoshone per se. They organized, they tried to gain control over this claim. Many were opposed to accepting it for a variety of reasons. Some felt the money wasn't enough. Some felt that it was tantamount to relinquishing the land, which some held that they had never done. Others because they felt that they should have control over what happened to those dollars and not everyone on the Fort Hall reservation. And so two cases there, I think, were the Lemhis at Fort Hall and the ones at Salmon, who would travel down there to participate in these meetings, organized. And this organization, this effort to retain control over monies offered in restitution for the seizure of their homeland helped solidify, I think, this sense of Lemhi identity, that the Lemhis were distinct, that they were a group, and that they were from the Salmon River country. Indeed, when the Lemhi Indian Claims Commission award was finally accepted by the Tribal Council at Fort Hall, a resolution was passed, and it was called the Sharing Resolution, and all of the tribes and bands there on the reservation agreed to share all of the Indian Claims Commission dollars that had been awarded. But it's, the wording of it is really interesting, and I don't have time to read it in full, but it mentions the Lemhi Shoshone specifically a number of times as members of the former Lemhi tribe, descendants of members of the former Lemhi tribe. It will say all the tribes and bands on the Fort Hall reservation, including the Lemhi tribe, just making it clear, I think, that in their efforts to mask this separateness, this separate identity on the part of the Lemhi Shoshone, these efforts only really served to put a light on it. That the Lemhis there considered themselves a distinct group, and that many people at Fort Hall considered them different to some extent, insofar as their homeland was in this place too. So as I mentioned, the sharing resolution mentions the Lemhis specifically and no other group on a number of different occasions. So that's one of the examples that I wanted to raise in terms of the persistence of Lemhi identity during the 20th century. And this shows the various Indian Claims Commission cases that dealt with tribes that were at Fort Hall. Next, I wanted to talk about the Lemhi community here in Salmon, Idaho, which, as I mentioned, persisted so long. On a Monday in May 1993, a group of Lemhi elders and youths gathered on a hillside near the town of Tendoy in the Lemhi Valley to fulfill an obligation that apparently dated back to around 1820. And this was to replace a cedar pole marking a grave site. This task had been charged to future generations, and in 93 this group was fulfilling that obligation. And this was not a unique ceremony by any means. The Lemhis had been preserving and honoring ancestral grave sites in the Lemhi Valley from removal to the present. But this one was different insofar as, for the first time, there was no longer, at the outset of this ceremony, a sort of permanent Lemhi community in the town of Salmon. And so after the ceremony, participants gathered at a city park, the former site of the last village, where Lois was the last resident. And the group told stories of the Lemhi families that used to live here in town. And the local newspaper covering this event intoned, and I'm quoting here, "Although none of the Lemhi Indians now live in the Lemhi Valley, their roots run deeply here, and they have never forgotten the past that links them to the area. Members of the Lemhi tribe will continue to journey back to the lands of their ancestors, to honor their forefathers and to revitalize and pass on their native heritage to their children." As I indicated earlier, Lemhis, despite the note in the article, do still live in the Lemhi Valley, and as I think you'll see from walking around today, visit on regular occasions. And this is not a recent phenomenon. Immediately after removal, as I suggested before, Lemhis returned here and lived throughout town, but there was also a Lemhi Indian village, it was known, or encampment, which moved around town and generally occupied lands that had been donated by sympathetic non-Indian families, many of them pioneer families. Lois made reference to one of the last families, the Sims family, I believe, which had allowed the Lemhi village to occupy its land. But just to illustrate my point, here's a photograph of some Lemhis in Salmon, 1929, a village west of Salmon, and another encampment. A map here showing different locations where these encampments were over the years. I got this, I should mention, from the publication from the local high school here, an article that a young woman had written. The persistence of this village, I think, speaks to not only the Lemhi attachment to the Salmon River country, but also to the good ties that they'd forged with the non-Indian community here in the early days prior to removal. As I mentioned, the Lemhis and the non-Indian community had forged close ties, and I think I spoke to that some when I read that the quotation, and also just now made reference to it. Lois did as well, talking about the local stores that would sell Lemhi products, or to the jobs that they held in the valley. And so for a long time, the Indian and non-Indian communities here were very close. There's a picture of the last one here at the intersection of 93 and Kids Creek from 1980. Again, the quality's not great, but this is what's now Kids Creek Park. The Lemhis here in Salmon, I think, also struck a balance between integrating into this community and also maintaining aspects of their traditional culture. And some of these other slides, I think, speak to that. These are some photographs of a glove-making kit. This was one of the mainstays of the Lemhi Indian village, making gloves for sale, not only in Salmon, but some as far away as California. They would make them in bulk and sell them at some distance, at least as late as the 1930s. And then also here, some moccasins sold at a Salmon, Idaho store, purchased by Jed Wilson, longtime resident here, who allowed me to take these photographs. And then the Lemhis continued to rely on traditional means of subsistence right up into the late 20th century. Here are photos showing bitterroot harvesting above a Lemhi harvesting bitterroot in 71, and then in 1974 processing bitterroot at the Indian village here in Salmon. Some Lemhi tribal members in the village, 1958. But then, as this photograph suggests, I think, to some extent, integration into the local community. Here's some Lemhi children preparing for an Easter egg hunt in Salmon, 1964, looking plenty excited about that event. Ultimately, though, what had been seen by many as a sort of quaint reminder of the earlier history, I think, by others came to be seen more as an eyesore, maybe detraction to tourism, and as Lois indicated, the village was demolished in stages, partially in 1987, then shortly thereafter there was a fire, and then finally the last portions of it where Lois and Alfred had lived in the 1990s, and it's now Kids Creek Park. The final thing I wanted to talk about was the Lemhi, the importance of salmon in particular as a resource, but other hunting and fishing resources in the Salmon River country. As salmon runs in particular diminished over the course of the 20th century as a result of a variety of factors, which I'm sure we could debate, Indian fishing in particular came under heavy criticism by a variety of different groups, and ultimately the state of Idaho challenged the Lemhi's treaty rights to hunt and fish off-reservation after a Lemhi, Gerald Tinno, was arrested in June of 1968 for spearing salmon up the Yankee Fork River. Ultimately, this case went to the Idaho Supreme Court, which confirmed the Lemhi's right to fish for salmon off the reservation in areas that they had been promised that they could retain access to in the Fort Bridger Treaty, and depending on who you talk to, some other documents as well. But the contention over treaty rights and over Indian spearfishing in particular gave way more to cooperation, I think, in recent decades, especially after the Snake River sockeye salmon was listed as an endangered species. And the Shoshone-Bannock tribes and Lemhis started working thereafter more closely with the Fish and Game Department to help restore the runs. And I think that, that these signs have been more promising. And certainly cases like the Tinno case, like the Bologna decision in Oregon, the Bolt decision in Washington, have indicated that the Indian peoples are going to have a place at the bargaining table when it comes to preserving the salmon species. And the Lemhis and other Indian peoples in this area have been responsible about maintaining this resource, as they have been for generations and generations. So I see I'm running out of time. To conclude, just to reiterate that despite the Lemhi's absence from the history books in the 20th century, they have persisted culturally as a people and retained a sense of identity, which has been very much intertwined with their sense of this country as their homeland, whether it was legal struggles over gaining restitution, whether it was the Lemhi persistence, the sort of tenacity with which they clung to a foothold here in the town of Salmon, or whether it was their commitment to continuing to harvest traditional resources and to maintaining those resources for future generations. The Lemhis have really retained a sense of identity. And now I think the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery journey to the Pacific Ocean and back provides, I think, an opportunity for the federal government. The Lemhi Shoshone have not been recognized since 1907 as a distinct tribe or band. They've been essentially exiled to Fort Hull, 200 miles to the south. And so if we're serious about celebrating Sacagawea's contributions to the Corps of Discovery, or Indian people's contributions to the Corps of Discovery, and if the federal government is serious about pursuing a policy of self-determination, then perhaps we'll see federal recognition restored to the Lemhi Shoshone, Sacagawea's people. That's all I had to say. I have time for some questions.
I think we may have time for one question.
Okay.
So does someone have a question that they would like to ask? Yes, sir, coming up.
I'm a coin collector and have a collection of Sacagawea gold dollars. I think it's a beautiful coin. What are the objections to the coin from the Indian standpoint?
Well, let me, I guess, talk about the objections to the coin in general, including the Indian standpoint. Let me start with the caveat. Many people have said this coin is a long overdue recognition of Indian contributions to American history. So it's not like it's been entirely panned. But people have argued, for instance, that look at the irony of the juxtaposition of Sacagawea, who some people argue, and again, you can argue about Sacagawea until the cows come home, but some argue was essentially enslaved, and juxtaposed beneath the word above it, liberty. This has been one argument that's thrown out there. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with these arguments, but I think the Lemhi Shoshone arguments have more to do with the opting of the mint for the Mandan Hidatsa rather than the Sacagawea spelling, that is with the G without the J. And I've also read that that there would have been a cradle board instead of a sling. Finally, there was some objection that while the Lemhi Shoshone still exists, despite the fact that that's not widely reflected in history books, it was not a woman descended from the Lemhi tribe or band that was chosen to model for the coin, and that the artist might have done more research and found somebody who was descended from that group of Indians. Instead, they just went down to Fort Hall and selected somebody else. These are the things that I've heard anyway, and maybe somebody else can elaborate on this. Does that answer the question?
All right. Actually, we are out of time. And if you would like, this is John Mann, and he will be outside the tent in the next little while, and I'm sure he'd be glad to answer your questions out there. But let's give him a big hand. Thank you very much, John, for coming in and presenting.